Good morning, Mr. Wallace. Good to talk to you again from here in Kiev. First of all, have we raised our nuclear deterrence alert in response to what President Putin has done?
Well, look, Mark, the language that President Putin has used doesn't actually link to anything off a Russian readiness procedure. It's really, we assess him putting the deterrent into the communication space, reminding people that he has a deterrent, and it's also about distracting the world and the public from what he's actually doing in Ukraine. It doesn't link to anything specific in their readiness structures of their forces. So he's made this comment. We keep it under review, but of course, NATO has a nuclear deterrent. The United Kingdom is NATO's nuclear deterrent, but obviously we're joined by France and the United States. And we keep our readiness very high. That's why we have a continued at-sea deterrent. But, what we shouldn't really forget that this is a big attempt to distract away from his troubles in Ukraine by just deploying into the sort of media space these phrases.
Right, but have you, just to be clear, have you responded to what he's done in any way in terms of our nuclear
I would never
readiness?
comment on our nuclear deterrence posture for operational and security reasons.
Do you think he's crazy enough to instigate a nuclear conflict?
No, I think he has certainly done a lot of irrational things recently. Obviously, first and foremost, the invasion of Ukraine against all the advice, all the international lobbying. I think I'm not going to speculate on what he would or wouldn't do, but that's why we all keep our deterrence at a state of readiness in the West to make sure that we can deter.
But do you think a cornered President Putin would be a dangerous man?
I think he's a dangerous man now.
I mean, if things got so desperate, would you think he could deploy tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine?
Look, Mark, I'm not going to head down a road of speculation of what-ifs with President Putin. What we know is that President Putin is currently actually focused in the invasion of a sovereign country in Ukraine. He is a man that has shown himself to resort to all sorts of things, not least nerve agent on the streets of Britain. But I think he is focused with this, and I'm not going to go into speculations about nuclear weapon systems or anything else. I think that's just not only unhelpful, it's unnecessarily alarmist when actually his focus, his forces, his military leadership are focused on taking Ukraine.
Fair enough. What do you think is the latest intelligence? What do you see as the latest intelligence on how the Russians are doing and when you think Kiev could fall?
I think your report is pretty accurate. We've just published our daily tweet at the start, or the first tweet of the morning, which gives us our assessed defence intelligence view of where we are. The main bulk of those armoured columns that you've been talking about are approximately 20 kilometres north of Kiev, northwest of Kiev. Some of the sporadic fighting is those sort of stay behind or indeed advanced forces that I think you've covered on other days, still around but not having the strategic impact that I think Russia had hoped. That airport, that strategic airport that you covered, I think, on the first day, that has changed hands a few times, clearly didn't get captured by the Russians in the way that they'd like to have used it, and it's forced them to do all sorts of things. The Russians have not captured the big cities like Cherniv and Kharkov up on the side, up in the northeast of the country, quite close to some of their borders. But they have made better progress than their other forces, still behind schedule in the south. So they're not on schedule. They are in some significant areas of disarray. Their logistics lines are therefore slowed down, and that's because they've based all of this on this sort of bizarre assumption that the Ukrainians would welcome them as liberators, or President Putin has taken that assumption, and now that is not the case. That's causing them to pause. It's causing them to have logistical trouble. And, of course, you've seen at first hand the strong bravery of the Ukrainians and their determination to defend their country. And I visited that country, Mark, 5 times, 3 times security minister, 3 times as defence minister and twice as security minister. And if anyone wants to know the dividing line between Ukrainians and Russia, it is that interview you've just carried with an elderly gentleman who is signed up about the views of people in his country. In Ukraine, they recognize that individuals matter, their rights matter, and the Ukrainians' view of Russians are they don't count in the Russian game. It's simply just the powerful people in Russia that matter.
What would you say to Belarus? There are reports today that they are about to send thousands of troops into Ukraine to help the Russians. What would you say to them?
Well, I think Belarus has a lot more to lose by being closer to Russia than it has to gain. It is a very poor country anyhow. The president pretty much ran off, scuttled really to Kremlin when he had his rising recently, and has sold his soul for that reason. And now you have a vassal state potentially on the border. It won't help the Belarusians. It won't help the Belarusian armed forces. They're far less equipped than the Russians. They are not as good. They're not as well trained. And, if I was a Belarusian soldier, you should think that President Putin will be the first to put you in the front line because you are absolutely easy to sacrifice compared to Russian soldiers that he will think might have a political impact on him at home.
And on weapons and supplying weapons to Ukraine, have you managed to get any weapons into this country since the invasion began?
Yes, we've got lethal and non-lethal aid into Ukraine. I can't speculate where or how. I think that would put people at risk. The other thing I've done, Mark, which is, Britain was the first European country to step up to join America with lethal aid. I hosted last Friday a donor conference in Europe. We've now even got the Belgians and other countries who historically would have been hesitant delivering lethal aid. I welcome strongly the EU's position. It took quite a lot of effort.
But since the invasion began, sorry to interrupt you. Since the invasion began,
Yes,
have you managed to get
weapons
into Ukraine?
Yes.
Isn't the truth that it's all a bit late? You've known that there's a threat to Ukraine, certainly since 2014. Shouldn't we have been arming the Ukrainians for years in just, because of a possibility of something like this happening?
Well, first of all, the United States have been arming them since 2015, 2014. They were the first to do lethal aid straight after Crimea. We complemented that at first by training 20,000 Ukrainians, and also only, I think it was last year, or if not 18 months ago, we signed a contract with Ukrainians to supply them with fast attack boats with missiles on them. So Britain was at the forefront. We were also then the first European country to do it. But should overall the West, after 2014, or maybe even after 2008 in Georgia, been more proactive in delivering a stronger resilience package to a number of states? I think obviously, we can see now that, that should have been the case across Europe, but Britain has not been in that position. Britain has been in the lead of it. I have links with my defence counterparts because I have visited so many times. I engage with them. We give them military support, and we'll continue to do that. But I also think, you have to also recognise when you're up against President Putin, that his irrational behaviour, which it seems to be getting greater, means that it's definitely harder to predict what was happening. I was there in November. I was there, earlier, and even when he massed forces last April on his border, there were a significant number of European countries who refused to believe that he had any intention apart from intimidation. Yeah. Now, I think, the West, many countries in Europe will now be regretting those positions, but fundamentally Britain has been in the lead alongside the United States in helping those Ukrainians. And that's why we got to do the donor conference on Friday and brought 20, 30 countries around the table to deliver lethal and non-lethal aid. And now we're at the heart of the coordination of all those countries getting it into the country.
OK, I just want to get a couple more in. Would you support British volunteers coming over here to fight, as Liz Truss is suggesting?
Well, I think Liz Truss is right to say it is definitely, for all of us, a just cause, that this is about a sovereign democratic country being threatened or actually now invaded by a Russian state. And that is something that we should all stand up against, whether that's at home. I think what I'd say is we can all do our bit, whether that's donating through the Ukrainian embassy. I'd also say that, our armed forces are contributing in a proper way to doing this. If you're keen to help and you're a United Kingdom citizen, come and join our armed forces. There are lots of ways to help. Look, there are people who will go.
Better than volunteering to come and fight?
Well, I think what I would say is, unless you are properly trained, unless you are a experienced member of an armed forces, I think there are better ways for you to contribute to the security of Ukraine. The travel advice of the Foreign Office is not to go to Ukraine. You'll put yourself in harm's way. If people are determined to do that, my advice to them is there are many ways to help Ukraine. And unless you are a trained military personnel from a former career, as in you're not coming from our armed forces because you've got a job to do here, then I would advise you to explore with the Ukrainian embassy ways to do that.
OK, two more quick questions. Are we going to reverse the decision to cut 10,000 troops from our military?
Well, obviously, Mark, you wouldn't have noticed because you're focused on other things, but a few weeks ago I announced that the original baseline of 72,500 has gone up to another 500 to 73,000. And I've always said, as the threat changes, we must consider changing. The current strength of the army is 78,000. But what I have to say is something to really recognise from what the conflict we're seeing on our television screens is. I am not getting messages from the Ukrainians every day asking for tanks. I'm not getting them asking for armoured vehicles. I'm getting messages every day from the Ukrainians asking for anti-tank weapons, personnel being able to be carried by individuals. Yeah. I'm getting messages every day about anti-air missiles that can be carried by individuals. That's the type of warfare that is currently threatening the might of the Russian.
But we're entering an era, quite possibly, of confrontation with Russia, and you are effectively, let's be honest, cutting the army. Are you going to reverse? Are you going to speak to the Chancellor to get some money to reverse the cuts to the army?
Right. So, Mark, there's no cuts other than personnel. There's an increases to the army's capabilities. The army it's not just about people. Otherwise, you end up with the First World War where you have millions of people, but you don't have any tanks. The key here is to get that balance. So in the Defence Command Paper, we said a number of things should happen. One is spend the money on the armed forces, the people we have, to be better equipped, more lethal, more joined up, and at more readiness. Otherwise, you end up in an army I was in where we had on paper lots of divisions, but when you press the button, they were completely hollow because we ran out of money or we didn't have quite the kit to deliver it. So, and the other thing your viewers should understand, and I know they do, that, contrary to what a lot of commentators said, we got an extra £24 billion. We got the biggest settlement increase since the Cold War at the Defence Command Paper. That's not a cut in anybody's book. Yeah. We have changed to some extent the balance.
It's a cut in numbers of troops. It's a cut in numbers of troops. And I just want to finally,
Mark, could you acknowledge it's an increase in the defence budget? That would be useful if you could acknowledge it's an increase in defence budget. It's a massive increase. It's a massive increase in the equipment.
I was just talking about troops.
OK. So what we've seen in Ukraine.
Let me just ask you this.
Okay.
Let me just ask you this, because we've run out of time, I think. On visas, shouldn't we be doing what the EU is doing and allowing all Ukrainian refugees in?
Well, first of all, what was announced or will be announced later today is a first step. We're absolutely looking at all the different range of options we can apply to welcome Ukrainians in need. The first step is to make sure that Ukrainians who have family here, either settled or are dual nationals, that they can come and join them. But the second step we will look at about what we do with the refugee flows across the board. It's going to be a problem right across Europe, and we've obviously seen the European position change, I think, as of yesterday, and we will reflect on that, and make decisions in the near future.
So you may do what the EU is doing, in fact.
I think what we'll do is, just like the size of the army, Mark, we'll keep it under review, dependent on how situations changes on the ground. I think that's perfectly legitimate. Remember, Britain's been incredibly generous with the Afghan scheme and the ARAP, which I was dealing with during Op Pitting. We've been one of the most generous countries when it came to, obviously, the Hong Kong nationals. So we have a track record of being generous in this area. We'll make sure it's done properly, and we'll obviously keep it under review as the facts on the ground change.
OK, we'll let you go. Good to talk to you. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.